So now it is the exciting part. We get to write our application, which is going to be a simple calculator application. Now, do you remember what the acceptance criteria told us to do? Let's actually go over that real quick. We need 3 inputs, 2 numerical and 1 operation. And then what we want to do is we want to make sure that the 2 inputs, if they're not numerical, we want to throw an exception and exit the application. If the operation is not recognized also, that's another condition in the acceptance criteria. If the operation is not recognized, if it's not one of the 4 basic operations, then we also want to throw an exception and exit the application. If everything is successful, if the 2 inputs are numeric and the third one is an operation, then we can perform the calculation. And the calculation is performed by applying the operation to the 2 inputted numbers. So let's go ahead and start writing our application. I will start by saying input converter, and then I will say the name of our custom type is input converter. Then I will instantiate the object. And you might be wondering, where did we even get input converter? Well, this is a software development technique. We sometimes want to write first what we want, even though some of the things in that might not exist yet. So we're putting in placeholders, and later on we will fill them up. But for now, we're just writing the main core of the program. So let's go ahead and continue on. The next thing is, I want to have some type of engine that will do the calculation. The first thing is an input converter. As you've already guessed, it's going to take in the user input and convert it from string to a numerical data. But then I want to have another class that takes care of the calculation. As you see, I'm separating out my code in chunks, and all these chunks have a separate purpose. This is called the single responsibility principle, which we will be talking about a little later. But for now, let's continue on. I will say calculator engine equals new calculator engine. Once again, you could have named it anything else. This is just me naming our custom types and trying to make them readable and intuitive and understandable. Then we need to get the 3 inputs. So let's go ahead and do that. I will say double first number equals. Then I will imagine that the input converter already has a method on it called convert input to numeric. Once again, I just named it like that, but you can name it anything else if you're writing the program right now. So as I said, I'm going to name it convert input to numeric, and then it's going to have a parameter, which is going to be a string, and that string in our case will be the user input, which I will do by using console readline. Then I'm going to copy this and say second number is same thing. It's the input of the user, and then we take that and convert it into numeric data. Now, as you remember, after we get our 2 numerical data, we then want to get our operation. So I will say string operation equals console readline. Great. So we have all of our inputs now. And we have our placeholders for input converter and calculator engine, which we will fill out later down the line. Now that we have all the inputs, I will go ahead and perform the calculation and then store the value of that calculation in a variable. I will call the variable, first of all, the type is double, and the name of the variable is going to be result. And then I will say that I imagine that the calculator engine will have a method on it called calculate. Once again, you can name your method a little differently. I'm just imagining and putting placeholders as I'm going through the core of my program. So then calculate method will take 3 parameters. I say that it takes operation first, then it's going to take first number, then it's going to take second number. And after I get the value from this method, I will then go ahead and print it out, just like our acceptance criteria told us to do. So I will go ahead and say console, write line, and then I will simply print result. Now let's go ahead and create these placeholder classes. I will first create input converter. So let's go to Solution Explorer. We'll right click and then say add new item, click on class, and then just simply name this input converter. Great. So now we have input converter. For now, I will make the access specifier public, and then I will create a method on it called, guess what? Convert input to numeric, the thing that I've imagined. Also, see, input converter now is not underlined anymore. And basically, that's the great thing about this technique. Once you create all the placeholders and then you start creating them, they stop being underlined. So then you see only the things that you need to create. So let's go and do that. I will say public double convert input to numeric. And then I will take an input that is a string. And I will say arg text input. Now, a few things to note. First is that the return type is double, and in our program, when I'm converting the first number to the second number, they are doubles. Now why? Why is it not an integer? The reason is because when we divide the first number by the second number, for example, if the first number is 5 and the second number is 2 and we divide it and we get back 2.5, if this is an integer type, then we will only get 2 because integer does not support floating point numbers. And so for that reason, we want a double, because a double will support whole numbers, but will also support floating point numbers. So we will get, in that case, back 2.5 as opposed to getting 2. Another thing is that you realize that I put arg in front of the parameter name. This is a common naming convention, which some people follow and some people don't. I personally follow it, and this is my advice that you follow it as well. But you can totally skip that and just say text input as opposed to saying arg text input. So let's go ahead and create the method, the body of this method. I will say double converted number. And we've already done this, so you should be very familiar with converting numbers now. I will say if not double try parse. See, double also has try parse on it, as I've mentioned before. And then I will pass in the input. Then I will say out and converted number. So this, in case you have noticed, I am not assigning the try parse to a variable and then using that variable in our conditional statement. Instead, I'm just using the expression in the if statement and skipping the variable assignment. I mean, I could have also done it like this, where I say bool and some variable blah, which I then say, okay, take this variable and use that, which is very good for readability. But in this case, it's simple enough for us to skip that step, because at the end, the same value will be checked against it, whether it's blah or whether you just take this whole thing and use it right here. It doesn't matter. It's going to be the same things because it boils down to the same value. So then you can say, okay, so if the conversion was not successful, then go ahead and throw an exception. So we'll say throw new, and I will say argument exception. Remember, there were different types of exceptions, so this is one of them. And I will say expected a numeric value. Great. Let's say return converted number, if everything went well. Now, a few other things. You've noticed that I don't have a try catch around this as I've had it in my previous video when we were actually going over try catch. Now, the reason is because in my previous video, I was trying to demonstrate how to rethrow exceptions, and I needed that in order to do that. But in this case, since we're writing an actual application now, that is redundant to do. Only catch exceptions if you're going to be doing something with it. If you're only going to catch exceptions and then throwing them back up, then it doesn't really do much. Now, some people say that you always want to be logging each and every exception at each and every step, but I disagree with that a bit because that clutters up the log file. what you want to do is you want to log these exceptions at the main caller method. In this case, it will be the program. So once this catches that exception, it would then be logged in the main method. But catching it in the input converter and then logging it or rethrowing it back up would be redundant. That's why I don't have the try catch around this code. Now that's the difference between my explanation videos where I'm just going over each content and concept that you need to know, but then it's the difference between that and the actual application that we're writing. In the actual application we're writing, I'm only going to be using things that make sense and the best practices. But in my explanation videos, I might be using things to get the point across. So in this case, we won't be using try catch around this code because it is redundant. It does not make sense. So I will just leave it at this, and we have our input converter ready. So now if we go back, you see that we have these methods working. Nothing is underlined anymore. The only thing we need to create is the calculator engine now. So I will go ahead and go to Solution Explorer. Then I will add a new item. I will choose class, and I will create calculator engine. I will also make this public, and then I will make a method within it. Guess what I'm going to call it? Exactly, it's going to be called calculate, and this is the last thing that is underlined red. So I will go here and I will say public double, which is the return type, and the name is calculate, obviously, and then there are three inputs. One is a string operation, and I will say arg operation, then double, which is the first number, and then double second number. Okay, so now let's fill out what's inside of this method. First, I will declare a result variable, and I will return that result variable. Not much so far, but now we are going to make decisions based on the operation. And I will be using switch instead of conditional statement if, because now we need to have conditional statements to say if the operation is plus, then perform addition. If it is minus or subtract, then perform subtraction, and so on and so forth. Since we only have one value and we have a range of possibilities, I will, for that reason, use switch. So let's go ahead and do that. Then I will pass the value inside, which is going to be the operation. And then I'm going to lowercase it, remember? The lowercase method. The reason why I'm doing this is so that if anybody passes in the word add with all caps, I can still lowercase it and compare it with the value that's all lowercase on my side. And this is going to be doing ordinal comparison. So I will then create the body of switch. I will say case. And in the case of add, all lowercase. And also in the case of plus, I will be performing addition. So I will say result equals arg first number plus arg second number. There you go. And then I'm going to break. So see, there are two cases. This means that whether the case is add or if it's plus, it's going to be doing the same thing and then breaking it. So for these two possibilities, we'll have the same outcome. Now let's actually copy this and paste it. And I will do the same thing for subtract. And here we'll have minus. And here we will be subtracting. Then I will say multiply. And then we'll actually have the symbol and perform multiplication right here. And then for our last case, we're going to have divide and then perform division through a symbol. Then do division and assign the value to the result. Now for a default case, remember, we need to throw an exception. So we're going to use the default reserved keyword and say throw new invalid operation exception. There is an exception type for that as well, and that's what we're going to use. Then I'm going to say specified operation is not recognized. Specified operation is not recognized. Okay, so there it is. We have our calculate method, we have our input converter method, and we have our program with all of them using it. Great. Now let's go ahead and try to use it. So I'll actually breakpoint at the very bottom. Go ahead, open it up. And let's try some stuff out. I will say 1 plus 2, and then I'm going to say plus. See? That gave 3 back. So that's great. Let's try to break it. I will go ahead and say textual input, and see? An unhandled exception. Wow. Remember the try catch video where we have unhandled exceptions, whether it's being thrown for us or whether we are throwing manual exceptions? Exactly. So what do we need to do? We need to wrap this thing around in try catch to be able to handle our exceptions properly. So let's go ahead and do that. I will say try. Then I will, in the body of the try, I will put the actual code. I will say catch, and I will catch the exception. I will catch all kinds of exceptions. So I will use the main type. I will go ahead and print it out, and I will say console, write line, then I will say ex message. Great. Now our exception should be handled, which is great. But I will also put a comment here, and I will say in real world, we would want to log this message. This is a comment, and comments are there to show some type of message to yourself or to another developer about something that you want them to know. Now, you don't want to overdo comments because they get out of date. But if it's something that you really want another person to know or you want to remember yourself, then you put a comment. You can even put a to do here. You can say to do and say start logging exceptions. Great. I will go ahead and run it again, and I will give it an invalid input, and it will say expected a numeric value, which is great. The application handled this exception. Now it could have gone on, but we just decided to exit the application, though it was not an unhandled exception, and that's what matters. Now let's actually say 1, 2, but instead of the operation, let's say add, which is in all caps. Let's see if that'll handle it. And once again, it was able to handle it because it's case insensitive. Let's try one more. I will say 10, 20, and then I will use another operator, but that is not a recognized operator. Let's see how it'll handle it. And see, it says specified operation is not recognized. So it's great. We have written our simple calculator application, and the next thing we'll do is we'll start writing unit tests to verify the functionality of our application.